It was meant to be a routine business trip, but when an arrogant pilot pushes a black tech mogul too far mid-flight, an unexpected crisis forces him to take control in a way no one anticipated. The startling aftermath left everyone stunned. Darren Williams settled into the plush leather seat of his private plane, the hum of the jet engines a familiar sound. At 40, Darren had risen from humble beginnings to become the CEO of a booming tech startup. Today, he was headed to give a keynote at an exclusive industry summit in the heart of Silicon Valley. This flight was supposed to be a calm interlude before the hectic days ahead, but something about it felt wrong from the moment he boarded. The cabin was luxurious, trimmed with elegant wood paneling and soft carpeting underfoot. Darren glanced at the other passengers, a well-dressed woman, likely in her late 50s, eyes glued to her tablet, and a middle-aged man buried in a thick novel. The subtle sound of clinking glassware from the galley signaled the flight attendants were preparing drinks. Suddenly, the plane jolted. It wasn't turbulence. Darren quickly realized it was the pilot, Carl Martin, brushing past him in a way that felt deliberate. Darren furrowed his brow, having barely moved from his seat to organize his documents from the overhead compartment. "Could you stay in your seat?" Carl snapped, his tone sharp and dismissive. Darren blinked, caught off guard. "I was just grabbing my—" "Don't interrupt." Carl cut him off, his voice laced with disdain. "This is a private flight, not a bus ride. Stay out of the way." The words hung in the air, each one sharp like a blade. Darren felt his jaw tighten, but he forced a calm response. The woman across the aisle didn't look up, her face neutral as her fingers swiped across her screen. Darren sat back down, his mind swirling. Carl's words had struck a nerve. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was personal. The murmur of the flight attendant preparing drinks in the kitchen did little to calm him. He had been in similar situations before, dealing with men who felt threatened by his success, who resented seeing someone like him in positions of power. But Darren wasn't here for a fight. He had a destination to reach. A few minutes later, the flight attendant approached with a warm smile, offering Darren a drink. Her kindness was a small relief, but the tension between him and Carl continued to linger, growing like a cloud that wouldn't dissipate. Unbeknownst to Darren, however, the storm that was brewing in the cabin was only a prelude to something far more dangerous, an event that would shake his composure and test him in ways he had never imagined. The jet sailed smoothly through the sky, but inside, the atmosphere had turned icy. Darren tried to focus on the presentation he was preparing for, but his thoughts kept circling back to Carl's rude behavior. He had traveled often enough to know that not all pilots were perfect, but this felt different. Carl wasn't just having a bad day. He was intentionally difficult, almost like he resented Darren's very presence. After about an hour, Darren stood to stretch his legs. He walked to the back of the plane to fetch another water bottle, trying to shake off the tension. As he passed the cockpit, the door swung open unexpectedly, nearly hitting him. "What do you think you're doing?" Carl's voice rang out across the cabin, sharp and accusing. Darren froze in his tracks. "Excuse me? You trying to snoop around?" Carl sneered, clearly agitated. "Stay out of the cockpit. There's a reason it's off limits." Darren could feel his patience wearing thin. "I'm just walking to the back. No need to make a scene." Carl scoffed. "You people always have an excuse." The cabin fell into an uneasy silence. The woman across from Darren glanced up, her expression now tense, while the man with the book stiffened in his seat. Darren's grip tightened around his water bottle, but he kept his voice calm. "I don't know what your issue is, but I suggest you keep it to yourself. I've done nothing to deserve this." Carl's eyes narrowed as he leaned back against the wall, folding his arms. "Maybe you should mind your own business," he muttered, clearly trying to brush Darren off. At that moment, the flight attendant arrived, a worried look on her face. "Is everything okay, Carl?" "Fine," Carl grumbled, glaring at Darren before slamming the cockpit door shut with a resounding bang. The flight attendant offered Darren an apologetic look. "I'm really sorry. That's not like him." Darren gave a tight smile, grateful for her concern, but struggling to keep his frustration in check. He knew what was happening here. It wasn't the first time he'd been dismissed or belittled because of his race, but it never got any easier. He returned to his seat, his mind replaying the confrontation. The other passengers were quiet, their discomfort palpable, but not a single one of them said anything. A few minutes later, the plane jolted again, this time more violently. It wasn't the usual bumps of turbulence, it felt different. Darren's heart rate spiked, but not out of fear. The tension in the cabin had him on edge. He wasn't just worried about the turbulence anymore. Something else was happening. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and the flight attendants rushed to secure loose items. Darren glanced across the cabin. The woman was gripping her armrests tightly, while the man with the book was visibly pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the cockpit. Then, the plane lurched sharply to the left, sending Darren's water bottle skittering across the floor. Gasps filled the cabin, and the plane wobbled erratically. Darren felt his stomach drop, but instead of panic, he felt the familiar calm focus that he had honed throughout his career. He knew this was bad. Carl's voice crackled through the intercom, unsteady and strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are experiencing severe turbulence." But Darren's instincts told him it was more than just turbulence. The plane was unstable in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. He watched as the flight attendant whispered urgently into the phone, her face pale with concern. The next jolt came, more violent than the others. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with a hiss, and a collective gasp spread through the cabin. Darren's mind raced. Something was terribly wrong with the aircraft, and Carl seemed to be doing nothing to resolve it. Then, the cockpit door flew open, and Carl stumbled out, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with panic. "Can anyone fly a plane?" Carl's voice cracked with fear. The older woman stared at him, speechless, while the man with the book shook his head vigorously. Darren felt a tightening in his chest. He knew the situation was dire. His instincts screamed at him to act, but the decision wasn't easy. This wasn't his flight, and he wasn't supposed to be the one in control. But when the stakes were this high, there was no choice. "I can fly it," Darren said, his voice cutting through the panic. Carl turned to him in disbelief. "You? Are you joking?" Darren stood, his body steady despite the turbulence. "I'm a certified pilot. Do you need my help or not?" For a moment, Carl just stared at him, too shocked to respond. Another violent shake of the plane sent Carl stumbling, his mouth opening and closing in stunned silence. Darren moved toward the cockpit, alarms blaring inside. He slid into the pilot's seat, scanning the instruments. The turbulence was bad, but Carl's incompetence was the real issue. Adjusting stabilizers, Darren muttered, "We got this." Carl, frozen behind him, asked, "You really know how to do this?" "Flight school," Darren replied, focused. As Darren took control, the turbulence eased and the plane steadied. The warning lights flickered off. Carl, pale and silent, watched in disbelief. The flight landed smoothly. Darren walked off the plane without a word to Carl, feeling a deep satisfaction. He had taken control of both the plane and his destiny.